tubes, and the fimbriae that reach in. Okay, these are the three things that have to talk to each other. And we're going to start our story on cycle day 1. First question is, well, what is cycle day 1? And patients will often have different understandings of it. A lot of people think this once the bleeding stops. When the bleeding's over, that's the start of my cycle. The way we define it clinically is the first full day of bleeding. So if a woman started bleeding tonight at 5 o'clock, tomorrow would be her cycle day 1. So in cycle day 1, we're sort of at a baseline. I'm going to draw a graph over here where we start to also look at what's happening to the hormone. So here's time. Here's the concentration of the hormones. And we're going to be going along from cycle day 1, around the time of ovulation, and then the time for the next menses. Okay, so you'll be seeing what's going on in terms of communication, and then how does that track out in terms of what we're seeing in hormones. And when patients are coming in for their morning monitoring, what are we expecting to see in the ovary and uterus? Okay, and once we put that all together, you'll see like, oh, wow, to understand where we are in a cycle, we need the blood work and we need the ultrasound. In the ultrasound, we need to see what's going on in the ovary and what's going on in terms of the uterus. What's very confusing to patients and to a lot of people as they start working with this is exactly what you want to see at some points in this menstrual cycle is the opposite of what you want to see in others. And so pretty soon as you start to look through this, you'll be able to look at the cycle and say, yeah, that all makes sense. What I'm seeing with the blood work, what I'm seeing on the ultrasound, what I'm seeing in the uterus, that lines up. Or you might say, wait a minute, this hormone is elevated and I shouldn't be seeing that. I'm seeing that, there's something wrong going on. So do all three elements work together or do they not? So we're starting on cycle day 1. The first hormone that we're going to be talking about and the one that governs what's going on at the level of the ovaries is called follicle stimulating hormone. Thankfully, our field does not have too many. It has a lot of 3-letter words that are very confusing for each other, SISs, HSGs, and SHGs. So it's very good at confusing people that way. But a lot of these hormones, their names reflect what they actually do. So the first hormone we're going to be talking about that's made by the anterior pituitary gland is called follicle stimulating hormone. As its name would suggest, it stimulates follicles. And the follicles that we're talking about are the follicles inside the ovary. So just a little background about this. So as I think most people know, a woman is born with all the eggs that she'll have. And they live in this resting pool state, very immature eggs. Where there's a big misconception out there is that people think that once a woman starts getting her period, every month one egg starts to grow and gets ovulated. And then once all those eggs get used up, that's menopause. In fact, every month, it's not one egg of this pool that she was born with that starts to grow, but continuously dozens of these eggs start to develop. But in a normal menstrual cycle, just one of them keeps growing, and we'll see why it ovulates, and the rest die away. That's why in 1 month, a woman might be losing 50 or 60 eggs, not one. She'll ovulate one, but she could be losing 50 or 60. And we'll see what's happening and why birth control pills don't slow that down, and why going through an IVF cycle doesn't speed that up. So we're on cycle day 1. FSH being made by the pituitary gland is now traveling through the bloodstream and getting to the ovary. There, it encounters this egg that's not in the resting pool stage, not that really primordial stage, but has started to develop. And it starts to stimulate that egg to get bigger, follicle, which is the fluid around it, to get larger. And so you have a few of these start to grow. So when a patient comes in on cycle day 1 or 2 for an antral follicle count, that's what we're measuring. We're looking at these antral follicles, follicles that are not the primordial ones, but are there and are available potentially to respond to the FSH. The very, very immature ones, the very, very immature eggs, the ones that are in that resting pool that one was born with, those are not receptive to this hormone. No matter how much you give, they don't express the receptor, they're blind to it. So it's just these follicles that have started their development process that have exited the resting pool that could see FSH. So FSH starts going to the ovary, and it stimulates the ovary as the follicle is getting bigger to make another hormone called estradiol. We'll call it E2. The E2 leaves the ovary, so it's being made as the follicle gets bigger, it's making more of this estradiol. It leaves the ovary and it travels to the brain so the brain can see, oh, look, there's a follicle that's growing. I can now start to make a little bit less FSH. Less FSH because we have one growing. As a follicle gets bigger and bigger, it needs less and less FSH. So when you have this feedback mechanism, that's why normally one follicle, the one that was sort of in the lead, keeps growing and the rest start to die away. So the FSH levels come down. One follicle, the big one, can keep getting bigger until it's mature. That could be, let's say, 22 millimeters in size. So you're going from, let's say, 5 millimeters here all the way up to 22 millimeters. As it keeps growing, what's happening to the estradiol levels? They keep going up and up and up. So the estrogen is getting higher until eventually the brain says, wait a minute, we've got high estrogen that's been going on for a few days now. That's telling me, meaning the brain, that there's a big follicle here that's ready to ovulate. Right? Because that's the problem. How does the brain see what's going on in the ovary? That's how it's seeing it. It's listening to this hormone that's being secreted. So the estradiol level's coming back. The brain sees that. It now makes a second hormone to trigger ovulation. That hormone is called LH. It sets out a pulse, a single pulse of LH. That pulse surge might last less than 24 hours. And that is the last pulse that tells this follicle with a mature egg in it, hey, you're mature, you're ready to be ovulated. And then the egg gets released. There's the egg. In real life, by the way, the egg is about the size of a period at the end of like newspaper sentence. So you can see it with the eye, but you have to have good eyesight to see it with the eye. Is that fair? Description? Interestingly, the sperm is one. So the egg is the largest cell in the human body, and the sperm is the smallest cell in the human body. So you really see an incredible disconnect. So the egg gets ovulated. Then it would normally get picked up and brought into the fallopian tube. This area here is where fertilization would normally happen. So it's not happening up here, it's not happening in the uterus, it's happening either in the fallopian tube or in our IVF lab. After the egg gets released, that's not the end of the story. The ovary then starts to produce a different hormone. So the point where the egg gets released, that cyst, that until now has just been a black circle, if you look at it on an ultrasound, it's just a simple follicle. That spot, and this doesn't happen anywhere else in the body, becomes a new organ. It becomes a corpus luteum. So corpus luteum, like the name suggests, corpus body, luteum is yellow body. Again, thankfully not too creative with the naming, but very practical. So we don't have yellow, make that in green. And that corpus luteum is the only place in the body, other than a tumor, where you have new blood vessels growing. So we have angiogenesis occurring. You'll see just how widespread this interest is because when they're developing anti-cancer drugs, one of the ideas was, well, a tumor needs to have new blood vessels growing. So why don't we create drugs that block new blood vessel formation? One of the things to be aware of is that it will impact the ability of the progesterone to be produced and the normal menstrual cycle. So obviously, if you drugs to treat cancer, that's one of the things you have to do. But it's interesting that's the only place in the body where normally, meaning outside of cancer, this kind of a process to be happening. So corpus luteum produces a hormone. The name of that hormone is progesterone. Good. And again, gestation. Okay? The progesterone is what helps support the pregnancy. And that's when we're now going to bring into this whole story, the second, I guess really the third key organ that's involved in this, the uterus. Because everything we've been talking about now has been between the brain and the ovary. So of course, for pregnancy to succeed, you need a third structure involved, the uterus. So as we were going through with the same hormones, you have the estrogen levels here. So we said the follicle stimulating hormones coming down, stimulate the follicles to grow. It's growing follicles producing estrogen. Those levels are going up and up and up, telling the brain you have to make less and less FSH. One follicle keeps growing, the rest die away. The estrogen that's being produced, while it's true that that's what the brain is using to know what the ovary is doing, that estrogen is also communicating directly to the uterus, saying, hey, we're growing follicles, start to get ready for a potential pregnancy. So the estrogen, the estradiol, the same estradiol, is also communicating with the uterus, and it's stimulating the lining of the uterus to grow, to get thicker. So at the beginning of the cycle, the lining will be thin. So if you look at the endometrial stripe, it might be, let's say, 3 millimeters. The estrogen is now stimulating the lining to get thicker and thicker and thicker to grow until it could be typically greater than 8 millimeters. Okay, there it's growing and growing and growing. Now, what happens if you put a perfect embryo to this really nice, thick, healthy appearing lining? Nothing. There won't be implantation when you do this. If you take an embryo and you put it anywhere in the body, it will implant, except the uterus for most of the menstrual cycle. So if you take an embryo and you put it in the fallopian tube, it won't plant. If you put it on the ovary, it won't plant. I don't know who was listening to Grand Rounds this morning, to Eminem, but they presented a case of an 18-week fetal demise. But what's unusual about it was in the abdomen. It wasn't in the uterus. So the baby had grown to 18 weeks. It was implanted onto the small bowel. And then this was diagnosed. So a very tragic case. But an example of how embryos love to implant. They're very good at that. And they tend to implant. People always say, like, we get ectopic pregnancies into C-section scars, into fallopian tubes. They're implanting everywhere. And sometimes we have patients where they don't get any implantation inside the uterus. And that's true. There's this conception that an embryo, pardon the pun, there's this idea that the lining of the uterus is a place where the embryo implants. It's actually a filter to block implantation most of the month. Because if you have an embryo arriving in the uterus a few days early or a few days late, it's probably not going to be a healthy embryo. And it's not good for the mother at that point to get pregnant. If that's probably an unhealthy embryo, better to not let it implant, wait for a healthy embryo in the future. So just like this, you can have a very healthy, thick lining, but if all it's seen is estrogen, it's not going to be receptive. That's where the progesterone comes in. So the progesterone that's being produced, the progestation, that comes along to the lining, and it actually changes its structure to allow the embryo to implant. Once you've added the progesterone, and the timing of that's also critical. Once you've added the progesterone, the lining converts, so it's receptive. But if you have too much progesterone, it won't be receptive. And that little time frame, that window of time when an embryo can implant, is what we call the implantation window. So, for example, I don't know if you've heard of this drug Plan B, it's an emergency contraception. All it is progesterone. But if you take it very early in the cycle, before it normally would be produced in the body, it's going to shift the implantation window earlier. So that if fertilization has occurred, by the time the embryo gets to the uterus, the window will have shifted. They'll miss that window and the woman won't get pregnant. But if a woman's pregnant already and you take progesterone, that's just like when we give patients progesterone. It's not going to cause a loss. It's not really necessarily helpful, but it's not harmful either. So once we see this, we start to see how the different things that we talk about start to layer in together. If implantation occurs, the embryo, really the outer cells of the embryo, start making final hormone, which is HCG. That HCG communicates back to the corpus luteum to say, hey, there's a pregnancy here. Keep this progesterone going. Keep this pregnancy supported because there's a pregnancy that's ongoing. If there's no pregnancy, if there's no HCG, the corpus luteum then says, okay, I guess there's no pregnancy. You don't need more progesterone. Progesterone stops, and the lining sheds, and the next menstrual cycle starts. Now, what we're going to do next, I'm just going to lay out on this what you'd expect to see in terms of the blood work. And then finally, we're going to overlay on that. How does all this fit into what happens when a woman takes birth control pills or when she's taking the medicines that we give for fertility treatments? So what are we seeing on ultrasound? And the cycle start, you see a quiet ovary with just these natural follicles in line. As the cycle progresses, you start to see in a natural cycle, one follicle getting much bigger and the lining getting thicker. After ovulation has occurred, you should see a corpus luteum structure, and that kind of looks, here's what wiggly lines on purpose. It looks like that. You should see that in one of the ovaries, and you should see the lining looks a little bit different. It has this, in ultrasound, the white outer part of it starts to look, the outer part of the lining starts to look a little bit more shaded. So if I'm looking at the uterus on cross section, here's the uterus, here's what we call the triple stripe. So this is the smooth muscle wall of the uterus. This is the lining. When we talk about the triple stripe, this is 1, 2, 3. Those are the 3 parts of the triple stripe. This is the thickness that we talk about being about 8 or more millimeters. Once there's progesterone, you can often see a haziness, a white haziness that starts to happen. Okay, so that's what you're seeing as you go through the whole cycle. What are we actually measuring in terms of hormones? So the first hormone we'll look at is going to be estradiol. So estradiol levels at the beginning should be low, and there shouldn't be a follicle there. So you might see something less than this. So we use the numbers. Let's see that. As the follicle gets bigger, because of the follicle stimulating hormone, the levels will come up, and they peak typically around 300 at the time of ovulation. After ovulation, there's actually a natural little dip that can happen. And then that brings us to here. And if there's no pregnancy, then the levels start to fall. So that's what's happening with the estradiol. What's happening with LH levels? So LH will typically be low. What's that song? Low. As you come along here, that's when you get your surge. You're realizing why I couldn't become a singer or you get to here, you have the LH surge occur. Here's that peak where the LH level can get to, let's say, greater than 20, 50. That's that surge from the brain saying time to ovulate. It comes back down and it stays for the whole time. And then the last big hormone to be looking at is progesterone. So the progesterone levels should also be low all around here. And then after ovulation occurs, then we'll see them come up. And if there's no pregnancy, then they'll fall again. So you can see what the pattern is between these 3 hormones. They look different everywhere you are in the cycle. So when you look at just the blood work, and this is a good exercise to do just to start sort of training yourself. Look, when patients come in for morning monitoring, look at either just the ultrasound or just the blood work. And say, based on the blood work, what do I expect to see on the ultrasound? And see if that's what happened. And based on the ultrasound, what do I expect to see in the blood work? See if that happened. But once you see it, you're like, wow, this is how the whole communication is happening. And when we watch patients go through a natural cycle, let's say for a frozen embryo transfer or just monitoring their cycle, you can really see this playing out beautifully. It's an amazing thing. And you also start to realize where there's a dysfunction. When things aren't working right, that's where you realize, this is where the problem is that we have to fix. So in the last couple of minutes, just want to overlay where do birth control pills on one extreme and all the medicines we use for fertility treatment, how do they fit into all of this? So the first one we'll talk about will be birth control pills. So the combination oral contraceptives or oral contraceptive pills, all they are is a combination of estrogen and progesterone. And there's something that the patient is taking every single day. So if that's going on, you can see what does that do to the communication cycle. The brain early on is going to be saying, hey, there's some estrogen present. I don't have to be making FSH to stimulate a follicle to grow. So the FSH levels can stay very, very low. Without FSH, there's no follicle growing. So you're not going to have a follicle develop. You're not going to have ovulation. Plus, you've always got a little bit of progesterone around. So even if that does happen, a follicle grows and ovulates, this lining has been seeing progesterone from earlier on, the patient's been taking. So what's going to happen? the lining is going to stay very thin. So even when a patient is on continuous birth control pills, meaning it's not like she takes 3 months and then a week off, then another 3 months. So when you do 3 weeks, week off, and then another 3 weeks, you'll be getting monthly periods, right? Because you build up a little bit of a lining, you're shedding. A misconception that's out there is when a patient takes it continuously, so 3 weeks, and then immediately starting another 3-week pack, and then another 3-week pack. One of the thoughts is, oh no, that's really not good because you're just going to be building up a thicker and thicker and thicker lining. That's not good. That's not what happens. Lining actually gets very, very thin. That's different though from patients who have PCOS. In patients who have PCOS, they're not at the normal baseline. They'll have tons of follicles that are all starting to grow and sort of crowding each other, making more and more estrogen. That estrogen is going to keep stimulating the lining to get thicker and thicker and thicker, stimulating continuous growth of the lining. But the follicles are all fighting with each other, so they're not ovulating. So you never get progesterone, which means you don't get that last stage of lining, and you don't get a regular period. In that case, this is why it's so confusing. In a PCOS patient who's getting a continuous stimulation of estrogen, so that's not good. There's risk of hyperplasia or endometrial cancer because they're constantly getting what we call unopposed estrogen, the opposition to progesterone. So they're just getting continuous estrogen to stimulate the lining without that last step to allow it to finally mature and shed. So continuous birth control pills, thin lining, PCOS, thick lining. That's the problem. The last word will be what happens with all the medications that we get. We get Clomid or Letrozole, or follicle stimulating hormone like on the left. All of those things are working to increase the amount of FSH present. They do it in different ways, but the net result is to increase the FSH. What that does is it rescues all those follicles. That normal feedback, which is higher estrogen levels, mean let the big follicle grow and the rest die away. We've broken that feedback. We keep giving a lot of FSH. So it rescues all the follicles. So the last point that I'll end with is just what does that mean in terms of, let's say, the lifespan of the ovary, or a lot of patients think in terms of when I'll enter menopause. When you take birth control pills, this exiting of the resting pool isn't affected. You're still having that one egg leave. It dies away because there's no FSH to stimulate it to grow. So the whole resting pool gets used up at the exact same age. So if a woman starts birth control pills at age 13, she'll still enter menopause at the typical age of about 51.7 in the US. On the flip side, when we give patients Clomid or Letrozole or injectable cycles, all we're doing is rescuing those other follicles that are there. That's why when a patient's taking those injectable medicines and we're rescuing all those eggs, instead of the estrogen going up to 300, we can go up to 3,000 because there's all these other eggs there making all that estrogen. You're going to say, well, why don't we have ovulation occur? Well, we would if we didn't have another drug like ganirelix, what we call antagonist, that blocks that surge from happening, that blocks that LH trigger from occurring. Okay?
Thanks, Williams. You have a section that talk about why the estrus is beneficial.
Sure. Chantal, you So your question is, what happens if we give more estrogen in the luteal cycles? You come in over here, normally estrogen cycles start to fall, particularly in older patients where they have to make more FSH. They might be now stimulating the follicles to grow. You can get premature recruitment from the follicle. So at this point here, their FSH levels are high, but their ET levels come down lower than this. Their brain might be making more FSH. And all the way over here, they might be having now a new follicle growing. So that when they come into baseline, you're like, okay, we expect to see these nice little small follicles. You might see one that's already started to grow. Instead of being like a 5 to 10 millimeter size, you might have one that's 12 or 13. And then if you start to stimulate that one sort of left ahead of all the others, you got this one follicle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the other ones get sort of a second cohort up behind. So one of the ideas behind starting estrogen in the luteal phase is to prevent that. I should clarify. There's 2 phases in the menstrual cycle. One is the follicular phase, where we're growing a follicle. and one is the luteal phase, where you have the corpus luteum. So what we're talking about here is the follicle and the corpus luteum. That's defining the follicular phase of the luteal phase. So the other big advantage of the estrogen in the luteal phase, I think it helps keep the follicles more in synchron with each other. So less of a spread, more of a cohort together.
We use a lot of it. People should.
Yes, absolutely. So just a little teaser. One of the next summer schools will be all on the IVF cycle. So we'll spend with Dr. Foreman and he's going to start to go through a lot of these steps in a lot more detail. But I think this is just a good way to start by overview, seeing everything. And then as you're reviewing patients and as you're seeing plans, and patients will say, oh, those start high estrogen, or there's a large follicle, that's why. And if somebody's not growing up the follicles the way they want to, or there's a need one, see why that is. And it's also why if a patient calls you, says, I just had an ultrasound done and they see a cyst in my ovary, I'm so worried. They're like, well, what cycle day are you? You're 21. Oh, so you're a week after you ovulate. So I expect you to have corpus luteum cyst. That's not bad. That's actually what we expect to see. But if someone says, I'm cycle day 21, I don't get my periods, I look, and my ovary looks like a baseline form, just those little ones, pass them up. So one of those things, like if you have a complex cyst, cycle day 21, there's a chance you just ovulate. If you had that cyst on cycle day 2 or 3, there's something that's wrong. All right. Oh, before. Actually, picture.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, perfect. Everybody on Teams, you also get credit. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
People